Hi, and welcome to the OrgDev podcast. So across organizations, expectations keep rising while resources don't, and change just keeps on coming. So how do you build an organization that can adapt and not just survive, but thrive? This week, we're honored to be joined by Dr. Linda Holbeach, researcher, author, and leading voice in organization development. Her book, The Agile Organisation, explores how businesses can become more responsive, innovative, and sustainable, not through service level changes, but by rethinking leadership, culture, strategy, and people practices. In this conversation, we're going to talk about what agility really means in today's world, beyond the buzzwords, and why resilience, adaptability, and innovation are now critical capabilities, and the deep tensions leaders face between control and empowerment. And really importantly, what can HR and OD teams do to enable lasting, meaningful change? Now, as I said, we're absolutely privileged to be joined by Dr. Linda today. She has played a large part in shaping our approach to organizations, OD, and HR. Linda is co-director of the Holbeche Partnership. She's an adjunct professor at the Imperial College London and a visiting professor at 4 other universities. She acts as a consultant on OD, HR, strategy, and leadership, and she's also a fellow of Roffey Park and the Institute of Employment Studies. She was previously Director of Research and Policy at the CIPD and Director of Leadership and Consultancy at the Work Foundation. And in 2021, she was named as one of the most influential HR thinkers by HR Magazine. Now, Linda is incredibly prolific. I counted 21 books. So that's 3 pages of Amazon. And when you read through the books, it's just such a rich, diverse field of thinking, and all of it is of the highest academic quality. She's also co-author of Organisation Development with Mian Chung Judge, and that is, and Danny's holding it up now for those that are watching, absolutely obligatory reading for all people serious about embracing an OD approach. And she's also author of the Agile Organisation, which is now in its 3rd edition. So thank you so much for taking time out to join us today, Linda. And Danny has actually can show how much she's devoured the Agile Organisation book, which is what, 54 post-it notes in there.
There's a lot. There's a lot of good content. Oh, we're really pleased to have you with us. We've been looking forward to talking to you, but there's such an important topic. So just kick us off. Just tell us a bit more about the work that you're doing and what that involves.
Well, I'm currently doing a fairly diverse range of projects. One is to help a university that is expanding its international operations and wants to avoid its overseas bases becoming rivals to itself. Because international students can stay and study in the countries that they live in, and they can therefore undercut the central organisation. So in a way, I'm helping out with strategy around that and ways of organising that hopefully lead to cooperation as much as competition. Another project that I've just been working on has been with an intergovernmental organisation which is facing up to severe challenges in delivering its service in the world, not least funding, in view of recent events in America. And so it's been a privilege to work with them on what effectively was a sort of organisational review, though it was called a learning needs analysis. And it's, as so much work as we know in OD, whatever the entry point is, it's often, if you take a systems view, a much wider piece of work so that people can see what some of the issues are that have a bearing on the presenting issue that need to be addressed. So I'm doing, as I say, an odd mixture of things, including some coaching and mentoring and examining at a university where I'm a visiting examiner for an OD programme, keeping me busy.
Fabulous. I think there's so many things we could talk to you about, given your experience and interests. But we wanted to kind of focus a bit on the organisational agility thing. So the world our businesses and organisations are operating is rapidly changing. It's kind of, it's a cliche, isn't it? Unprecedented change, but it really feels like it's really complex to navigate that. So we hear a lot of people, organisations say we need to be more agile. That's what we want. it'd be really good to unpack that a little bit with you. So how did you define organizational agility? What's your definition of that? Because it can mean different things to different people.
Yes, well, it takes the notion from nature, I suppose, of agility as something that's nimble, that can leap if need be out of harm's way, or leap towards its prey, or whatever. It sounds rather negative, but you know, it can seize opportunities if you like. But it expands the notion to the system that is an organization. It's to do with how you operationalize your work in such a way that you can deliver with speed, with innovation to meet the changing needs of customers. You're open to embracing technology and different forms of technology to help you with that. It's very customer centric, and to that extent, it should drive the way you organize work structurally and the processes that you use. So typically an organization that is agile tends to have flatter structures that are more team-based. Not all of them, but you need at least what Adler in 1996 was calling an enabling bureaucracy. You need to have a little bit of structure in there to make the whole thing hang together. And to make that kind of organizational agility possible so that you get more experimental work reaching the marketplace and getting feedback from the marketplace and being renewed and reinvigorated and sent off in new directions, you need a culture that's conducive to that. And that means you need the kind of situation where you can genuinely experiment and make mistakes sometimes, and you don't get hung out to dry. And, you know, some of the leading tech companies have cornered the market, if you like, years ago in this with Google's fail fast and that kind of thing. It's not about, you know, expecting everything to go right all the time, but rapidly learning from what works and what doesn't work and sharing that knowledge. So there's a very strong component in organizational agility that is to do with learning organization. That's an old term from the 1990s, but it's like all these different theories that have been bubbling up for years, in a way completely relevant to the world that we're in now, and are all enabling of faster moving, more decisive, more innovative delivery in a world where what you were doing yesterday is no longer good enough.
And you touched on there about the point around kind of organizations being innovative, but also kind of maintaining that stability and kind of business as usual. That's a tension that organizations need to find a way of managing. And some of them split off and go, we're just going to have an innovative team over here. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that, you know, again, I keep on thinking of the term traditionally, you know, because the idea of in the 80s and 90s, you did have separate departments, you know, colloquially known as skunk works and so on. They're the guys who come up with the great ideas. They're the engineers. They're the whiz kids. Everybody else just keeps, you know, doing the day job. I think the notion of organizational agility, though, melts the boundaries between skunk works type operations and everybody else, because in a way, it's an organizational capacity that needs to be slightly more infiltrated. This notion of we can experiment, we can find out what works, we can share our information both with our team and across teams, so that, you know, it's not just the brand new prototype that the skunk works type people are working on that we're interested in innovating. We're interested also in the day job and how we innovate that to give greater satisfaction to customers or to save cost or whatever. But I think what you were alluding to, the tension is often resolved, if it is resolved, by being cautious to begin with. And some companies hive off one business unit to try out some of the agility methods, if you like, to see whether it does actually make a difference and what can be learnt from it. It's almost like there's an evolutionary trail. But I think what is noticeable is that very often you have to let organizations not just learn from one business unit, but let every business unit do their own bit of experimentation in a manageable way. Because what you're trying to do is get people to own what they're doing, but have enough common language and have enough common disciplines that that knowledge can be shared, even if you're working on different product lines or whatever. You can communicate with each other because you're adopting similar methodologies. You've got, you know, the sort of standard agile methodologies are adopted by or come from firms like Spotify, you know, which lots and lots of banks and others have copied. You know, the notion that you have guilds of people who are expert in particular fields who, you know, there's a positive infiltration of knowledge development across an organization through networks that are part of what's expected of people. It's a discipline. Likewise, you know, the stand-up meetings in the morning so that everybody knows where they are. You're keeping feedback is live, you know, you're on track or not on track, and what are we going to do about it? The tension is often resolved through gradual infiltration of bits of learning from experimental areas and a determination to take that learning and spread it, but not apply it as a template to everybody else. There should be some, you know, the old OD phrase, you know, I own what I help to create, applies very much to this. But in order for that to happen, you need real determination from senior management to stick with it.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question, actually, because you talk in the book about it being agility as being like an advanced management capability. So I was going to ask you, what do we need from our leadership teams to really make agility kind of the way our organisations work?
Well, this is always, I find, where things can go wrong and get unstuck. Because by and large, this is a vast generalization. You know, leadership teams often comprise people who have got to the top of their tree, either through their technical expertise or their business prowess, you know, track record, reputation, etc. And often they're quite driven people, and often they think they know the answer to what's needed for the organization. And depending on the timbre, a French term for the tone, if you like, of the management team, what the CEO is like. If you've got a very, very strong CEO who's a bit of a visionary and who believes in trying this agile stuff out, seeing if it can really deliver new technology-based products and services or new ways of working that will actually accelerate delivery. If you've got a very strong leader who believes in it, you may find the rest of the management team willing to go along with it if they respect the leader. But there's a cost to a lot of people in the management team by so doing, because in many ways, if you flatten the structure, they lose their power bases. If you introduce team-based operating, especially if you're pulling people from different parts of a business to cooperate, to work together on a particular project, one director may lose their best people to another part of the business and so on. So there's, you know, there can be a degree of resistance to, or an inclination to find out what doesn't work as opposed to what can work. But where you can exercise as a leadership team some real commitment to seeing things through and adopt some of the agile methods, for instance, of holding meetings, of making decisions, of communicating, bringing on talent in different ways, you can actually transform organizations' fortunes relatively rapidly. And, you know, for that, as I say, generally, the old adage of herding cats, you need a good herder or enough cats willing to play with the mouse and see if it works. And I think there is something about, you know, you need leaders in that sense who are genuinely strategic, who are looking out and seeing how the world is changing, 10 years ago, we were talking about AI, but there weren't that many organizations that had really embraced the potential, except perhaps in advanced engineering or whatever. But now, who isn't talking about AI? How is work being transformed in every sector? Medicine, you name it. So a leadership team and individual leaders do need that ability to look at the way the world is changing, figure out what is that actually going to mean for our organization and its products and services, and what will be expected of it, not just by our board, but by our customers, our current customers and our potential customers. Is that going to mean that we're going to carry on doing what we've always done, or are we going to have to change things? And what are the nature of changes that are going to be required? What will that mean in the way of the workforce and the skills that they will need? How much of the work that we do now will be done automatically or through other elements of AI? Therefore, how do we lead the change or changes that are going to enable us to scale up our operation? Because you can carry on doing what you've always done, but you can seize more market share if you can scale up quite rapidly and move into new markets and seize the market, as it were. But in many cases, if you're strategic, you find organizations that actually change what they're doing. It's not about sticking to the knitting that we had before. It's about creating a new pattern.
There was a particular talk that you were given on YouTube, and you say that it's important to make sure that managers aren't the most overloaded because they can't do the right thing for their team, and whatever that team is, whether it's the leadership team they're part of or the team as well. But managers historically are often the most overloaded, aren't they? Yeah. How do you sort of see that play out? How do you create the space for leaders to have that cognitive space to do this thinking?
Well, I think it's, again, I agree, it is absolutely central to the success of agility, the ability of people to have a bit of time to think and to shift what's happening and be open to that. And managers in particular are critical to enabling everybody else to bring about the change. So how to make it possible for people to have that time to think? I think it's several things. One organization I've worked with, they have been completely overloaded by the need to rework almost everything that they do. They've got a very demanding boss who wants to know in detail what's going on everywhere in their operations. So reports of every conceivable kind have to reach the boss in perfect form. And you think, well, why? Surely that it's the directors who should know what's going, but given the nature of this particular boss, that's what's required. The end result is that there's a vast amount of overload from the most junior person to the most senior group of people endlessly rejigging reporting such that it reaches an acceptable form. Well, you'd think, why don't they just use ChatGPT to write these reports? And of course they say, oh no, it's open source, can't possibly, it's too secure and confidential, we can't use that. Little do they know that the happiest staff are using ChatGPT and their reports pass muster, they get through. So, there comes a point where you have to look at what's preventing us from spending more time to think, to shift, to have those discussions, those conversations that are going to be critical both amongst ourselves and with our teams, as well as lifting head above the debris of day-to-day pressure. And even if it's almost artificially constructed, setting up a regular get-together, even if it's only to moan initially, to look at amongst peers what's working, what's not working, what's coming round the corner, how are we going to manage that, what can we do to share some resource, because we're all under the cosh resource-wise, and actually making a disciplined decision that is implemented, that we do this. That was really useful, actually. We'll do it every fortnight, and let's next time bring to it a specific thing that one of us is trying to do, and really, see if we can ginger the system up a bit. Oh, and by the way, do you want me to lend you one of my people to help you with that? Because we've been doing something like that in my division or whatever. So I think there is something that is, pretty basic in the OD sense of creating these forums where people can and do share information. I think there's also a lot of awareness raising that can be done through seminars, webinars, podcasts, etc. And that, I'm not saying make it compulsory for people to spend time looking at these things, but where you want the top people to model curiosity around having a snack lunch with people and asking, when you saw that webinar the other day, what did you think about the threat from such and such? Or have you seen that podcast about our nearest competitor and, some of the innovation? And is there anything we can learn from that? Or should we be doing something, so that there's an incentive for people to take additional time out of their busy day to become more aware of what's changing and what some of the emerging practices that might actually help. And particularly, I think people in OD and L&D roles as well can do a lot actually to facilitate short workshops, give access to online materials of one sort or another, because there's so much stuff out there that might actually help a particular team or a particular manager with a problem that may be of their own making, but may just help shift something. I'm not talking about costly solutions to this, almost a cultural problem. Because the other thing is, of course, some people do naturally like to think of themselves as being very busy. Busy equals important. And, it's the thing about the Lone Ranger off, on his own with his dear horse, solving problems, coming into town and solving problems. That's actually not what you need by and large. It's more, how can you work with our teams, particularly to take stock and see if there are different ways of organizing our work that we can respectfully then link with others in the, that are codependent, other teams, and see if we can make life a bit simpler, a bit easier. Are there processes that are over lumpy? Can we remove some of the duplication? Are there policies for absolutely everything? What are the policies we actually need? Can they be reduced to the top 20 and that's it? Can we devise onboarding that from the very outset emphasizes to people, we want you to work, in the old phrase, smart. We don't want you to kill yourself, but we do want your ideas, and we do want you looking at ways we can collectively improve, as well as here's the information you need to do the job. So it's almost like, from an OD perspective, it's looking at the low-hanging fruit, all the things that organizations can use to help themselves, or that tend to get stuck in the weeds and are just an additional burden. And of course, well-being policies are potentially going to be needed, because if everybody's so stressed out through overwork, those need to be fit for purpose. But it doesn't mean gym membership for everybody. It's around, let's get to grips with what are the real issues and what can we do something about to make people's lives a bit easier. And by the way, can we thank people when we see them doing a great job and for going the extra kilometre or whatever?
And you talk in your book, don't you, about marrying capability with resilience, and it's not, you can't do you can't do agility as a standalone thing. You need to marry it with resilience.
Again, agility is inevitably, it's not disaster prone, but it is learning prone, shall we say. And you need to tolerate a bit of mistake making, as I said, but resilience is, both for individuals, and the Americans call it resiliency, but resilience at organizational level is the same thing. It's, can you recover from major setbacks? Can you, not just the odd little problem? And what's your attitude to the real difficulties that you're facing? Are you completely overwhelmed by disaster movies? Can't do anything, we're going to have to fight or flight, or are you able to look through the deluge to find some hope and have some faith that a way through it can be found? And I always link resilience with, the bridge between agility and resilience is looking out there, looking ahead. What are the saber-toothed tigers that could pounce? And, the most obvious ones, can we rehearse? Can we do behavior rehearsals to make sure we're not caught out, like happens, one hopes, with the emergency services, in the case of, a disaster on the underground or something. The same kind of thinking should be part and parcel of day-to-day work, really. It's sort of putting the values of the organization into practice. I used to find it strange. I did some work with in the nuclear industry sometime, with a firm in the nuclear industry some time ago, and these people all came to Roffey Park, where I then worked, and loved working there. And we were in a training room at the top of the stairs, and I was amazed at the start of, in those days, week-long programs, when I was just kicking off and starting off the program with a welcome, and someone stood up and said, "Excuse me, Linda, I just need to do our safety briefing for the day." And for 5 or 10 minutes had a thought for the day on some aspects of safety. This is odd. This happened every day, but a different thought for the day. And then going downstairs, I must have been wearing trainers or something with the lace that had come undone. They all stopped me, and I thought, on the one hand, I thought, this is ridiculous. But then I realized, of course, you need up to a point to indoctrinate certain practices so that you don't have to think about them. And resilience, a strong element of that is, what are the routines that we all know, like if you're in an operating theatre, do we all know the basic routines that will allow us to have a complex operation without the basic stuff falling down, without the anaesthetist falling asleep or whatever? And resilience is, again, linked with pulling the learning out of everything and reinvesting that learning into new ways of operating, finding ways forward that avoid the disaster scenario.
I guess one of the things I'm really interested about as you're talking is how, because a lot of this requires so much change, and sort of if you go to a flatter organization, people lose status, they have to put their ego to the side in the service of the organization. And you talked about the fact that 80s and 90s we had the skunk works, where they go off and innovate in a separate location or in their own time and come back and do it. And not everyone is able to actually get the ear of the CEO or the chair to give it the thrust to get this done. How do you create enough power or enough of a vision to get this going where the pain is worth the prize? Because there is so much required here, isn't it? There's a lot of, you're challenging the daily routines, the constructs, the way the system works, everything, aren't you, to drive this forward?
Well, good question. Clearly it's not easy at any level. But I think if you looked at most strategic plans of most organizations, you'll see somewhere in it the word agile as an aspiration, shall we say. And very often the lever to having a stronger conversation about agility comes where there's some investment in a technology to help the business go faster, or sadly lose jobs. And I think that's the unfortunate element, agility, that it's in some people's minds synonymous with job cutting. In practice, it shouldn't be at all. It should be about people having the opportunity to upskill, in whatever is their area of if they've been generalist, they may need to become much more specifically specialist in a particular area. It may be a technical skill. They may have a role that changes significantly with regard to working alongside technology or being partially replaced by technology. So what does that free them up to do? And, you know, the argument is that actually the human skills, particularly emotional intelligence, the ability to get along with other people, to empathize with people and so on, the customer handling skills in managing big complex organizations, those are the kinds of core skills that are coming more to the fore when people's work starts to be transformed. So if agility is introduced as we're all going to go into teams, it's all going to be flat structures, you know, be delighted, folks, naturally you'll get pushback because you're asking people to give up their empires, etc. You know, that's where there has to be something in it for people to want to do it. And, you know, there's often an element of people are having to suspend their judgment for a while until something works. That's where I think if you bring people together with others who've gone down the journey, I mean, it's not a template, you know, you have many, many variations on agility, but if you had people mixing and mingling with people who've introduced some aspect of agility successfully and gained from it, and introduce them to a team in another organization that's really skeptical about it, you know, that's a way of opening the door to the conversation, at least. I've often found, though, that, you know, the main barriers, as I said earlier, are in the management team. The people just below the management team are often pretty ambitious and they can see that this is a way to go. And they're often more willing to experiment with the structures, with the work processes than the management team are because they've got more vested interest in things as they are. So I think using the influence that the people just, that you know, what used to be called the high flyers or the high potentials and the fast tracks and all that, working with a group of people who are going to be the implementers of the agile approach, whatever it is, will gradually get on board the people more senior to them, at least give them license to play. The people who are having their jobs changed, again, it's more a question of, are you doing the other things that help people feel they have a stake in it? Are you involving them in discussions about it? Are you getting their ideas and trying to incorporate some of their ideas into what works? They know the work as is. So are you giving a few of them opportunities to go off and find out more about work as it might become and come back and educate everybody else? And are you rewarding them, you know, literally, financially, or at least recognizing them when they start down the learning journey? Years ago, I worked for an American financial organization that flattened its structures. It wasn't attempting to be agile, but it was trying to do away with what were known as checkers checking checkers, as in, why have we got all these supervisors and managers and, you know, senior directors? We just need one layer. And naturally, that the way it was introduced was unfortunately inept, you know. And I remember interviewing one senior manager at the time who said, I don't know now how I can tell my mother-in-law when she asks what it is I do. What in fact, in the end, it worked. You know, people got used to it. You know, all the office walls were demolished and it was all open plan, all things that people hated the idea of. But, you know, the notion that actually you can see people, you can connect with people, you're sharing ideas, you're learning a huge amount. And by the way, you're developing your employability elsewhere by taking on these new approaches. I think that's one of the risks, if anything, of agility, that where people become good at working in agile ways, they're increasingly being poached by others who want to have that kind of capability seeded in by somebody who's been there, seen it, done it.
Hi, we're just pausing this interview for a moment. Have you ever finished an episode of the OrgDev podcast and wish you had a cheat sheet that summarises all of the key points? Us too, so we made one. It's called From Pod to Practice, and each week in our newsletter we'll share a 2-page summary of the latest OrgDev episode, and it includes key takeaways, a reflection prompt, and one small action you can try.
And it's all in a digital format with space at the end to add your own notes and reflections, and it's designed to help you take the learning from the podcast into your day-to-day work. So to get your copy, just sign up to our Next Step to Better newsletter. The link's in the show notes, or you can visit our website at www.distinction.live to get the latest From Pod to Practice in your inbox. And let us know what you think. We'd love to get your feedback.
This is an enormous question, but what was your journey into your field? Like, how did you just make your decisions along the way to be that sort of main voice, or one of the major voices in OD and HR thinking?
Well, I'd love to say, it was a conscious decision at the age of 20.
You would be the first person in 70 episodes.
Well, I'd always thought that I wanted to be a teacher, and because when I was at school, your choices at a girls' school at that were secretary, nurse, or teacher, and I ended up becoming a teacher for 13 years or so. But first, I dabbled. I went into publishing just to try it out, just to see what it was. And ironically, the first organisation I worked for was known as the Institute for Personnel Management, and I was, as I say, I was working in the books department. On the marketing side, and I got to read some of the books and thought, oh, this is quite interesting. I think perhaps some of those books might be long on the remainder list by now. But that was the very last organisation I worked for, some many years later, the CIPD, the same organisation, but I hadn't planned that. I guess, after teaching, I was asked to join this American financial organization, because one of the things I'd done was I taught French, but I also did a lot of so-called schools industry work, trying to give young people who might not have an opportunity to have job interviews or whatever, to try and bring employers together. And I was working in West London at the time, and the corridor for employment for many of the young people was literally Heathrow at one end and Acton Town on the other end, limited because in those days the young people didn't go to central London to work or whatever. So all those employers, including this American financial services company, were there. And we did some good work, and I raised, I think it was over £1 million with a colleague to build a curriculum around life skills, as we think, how to put yourself over well and how to live a healthy life. So I had a slight interest, at least, in that when I went to work for this financial organisation, and I went into management training, had a whale of a time, loved travelling, enjoyed it very, very much, until in those days it was a credit card, charge card company. And when credit cards came about, out of an amalgamation of banks who brought out the Visa card that undercut significantly the charge card that the firm I worked for produced, it was a very serious time for the business, and they laid off a lot of people in the open plan office I was describing. And I can remember looking out over the barriers between HR training and everybody else, and seeing people absolutely devastated. And at the same time, the organisation was saying, oh, it's a brave new world, we're on to our new vision. And I kept on thinking, how is this going to work? So it gave me an interest in understanding if change is going to be constant, really, which in the 80s and 90s it became. How will you square the circle? How can you create a context where what's good for the business is also good for the people and vice versa. And so eventually I worked for Roffey Park and stayed there for 13 years. And I was a consultant. I worked in management development, but I also did research. I very much enjoyed finding out what people were experiencing. We did an annual survey called the Management Agenda in those days, and it gave us clues. It was a cross-sectoral thing, and it gave us clues as to what are all the different issues that people are experiencing. They almost all revolved around change, people feeling badly done to, not communicated with, etc., etc., which, cut a very, very long story short, brings us to OD, and I was also involved in teaching on the MSc in organisation development there, but also HR, because I thought so many of these issues are things that the HR community should embrace or does embrace, but maybe is struggling because they're, there's no template for these things. So so that's really what got me on track to both work with clients around their real issues, taking hopefully a systems view, big system as well as, whole system as well as organizational system. Trying to balance what the organization needs and what people need. You can't always do that, but, having as much an interest in how do people develop their careers in these changing structures. What's the future going to be for people if they can't upskill or reskill to something else? What's the future of work going to be? Those kinds of things, as much as, and what works now. So, agility as a theme, I would say I've been working on accidentally almost since about the year 2000. And gradually it crystallized into, but there's a whole load of methods that you can use. But it's not just methods, it's mindsets, it's power bases, it's earnest desires to produce something better, different, faster, cheaper, more innovative, where everybody gains. Idealistic, of course. But again, I think it's what's really driven me to try and see and what else could work.
And how was it when you set out to write the book with me and the organisation development book? Did you know that you were sort of writing one of the defining books of the profession that people would just keep reaching out to and would start a lot of people's journeys to it?
Not at all. No, I'd known Mayanne for 30 years or so, and we'd always said, oh, we should write a book sometime, because we were both very interested in what can actually help people. There's a lot of really good scholarly stuff out there on almost everything, we put into that book, really. But we were more interested in what have we learnt about organisation development and how HR as well can play the OD game in the nicest possible way. I mean, how can HR use its systemic role in a way that helps the organization become more effective? So, I remember the first edition of it, we took ourselves off to a retreat somewhere in a very sort of monk-like setting, which was so uncomfortable. We cut it short by a day or two. But, we flushed out the main thrust of the book. And then it took ages to write, because we could never quite agree whether we wanted the HR piece to be fully integrated into the OD piece, or who should write about the politics bit, and so on. We kept on changing our minds. So on various occasions, we'd actually duplicate a topic. So we have spare chapters that we didn't use. But in fact, we just enjoyed doing it in the end, and we're amazed to be asked to write a second and a third edition. And I'm just so pleased that Mayanne was well enough to finish that just before not long before she died. And she didn't know she was going to die, obviously, at that point, but she, you know, because of her poor health, had for years thought in terms of a legacy, that she wanted to leave something behind. And I think she did that, more than, and the thousands of people that she's trained over the years all speak, I come across many people who say, oh yes, Mayanne. And no, it was a great privilege really to write the book together, and we would both be delighted to think that it's proved useful to people.
We've had several people on the podcast, haven't we, who've quoted Mayanne as being kind of influential in their kind of development. And I think for us, the video she curated during COVID, the just in case equality, videos, is a wonderful collection of videos for people to learn from loads of people in OD. Really lovely collection.
Yes. Well, again, it was because she knew that at some stage, she would no longer be here, and she just picked brilliant people, great topics, and it is a fantastic legacy that she's left. This sounds like I'm boasting here, but I claim to have talent spotted her. As I say, it was well over 30 years ago that we met, and when I went to Roffey, I thought, we've got this marvelous MSc in OD, but we're organisation and people development, it was called. But we could really do with some heavyweight external scholars to come in. So I encouraged her to join us as a visiting fellow, and she did over the years very good work, as well as her own business and NTL and other things. As I say, this is vicarious credit to me.
I think the whole profession owes you both a debt of gratitude, because that book is something to hold on to. And I think it's not an easy transition into OD. There's people aren't licensed, they're not regulated, and it really gives something to people to hold on to as well. And things like the chapter around politics it's academically based, but it's very practical, and I think that's what's really useful. I think that's the skill in the writing, isn't it?
Yeah, well, thank you. And thanks on behalf of Mayanne. And, because as you said, it's such an evolving field still. And I think because it is eclectic and has so many different potential sources and potential routes to develop further, I think most people in OD roles, and HR up to a point, suffer from imposter syndrome. There's always something else. Oh, am I really an OD practitioner? And I'd encourage people to take as the main message, just carry on learning from everything you do, whatever your entry point is. Just don't treat that as the only tool in the kit bag. It's the old thing about, to the hammer every problem's a nail. If that's your one thing you do, but if it is the one thing you do, make sure you're brilliant at it, and what else would complement it, and that it won't always work. If you're supply driven, it won't always work. You've got to be where the need is and understand the need and help people to find their solutions. It is about, in some ways, getting out of the way, providing, if you like, the some sort of structure for people to have those sort of conversations and move their thinking forward and move their practice forward. And there are so many different ways you can do that. But essentially, I think that's broadly what it is. It's helping people to find their own solutions, having better understood what the issues are for them and their organisation.
So one question we always like to finish every podcast with is, what advice would you give someone who's considering or at the foothills of their career in organisation development? Because as you said, it's changed so much now, hasn't it? What advice would you give to someone who's considering it? And there's so many different pathways into it. So whether you're, an HR business partner that's thinking there must be another way, or you're in an adjacent field like psychology, and it's like there could be. What advice would you give?
Basically, satisfy your curiosity to start with about what is OD in the broadest sense. What's it about, and how does what I'm doing fit with a mindset that looks out from the black and white in front of me to explore some of the greys and blues around, because it's this business about, if you're in a ditch and you're digging, you may not see that there's blue sky above it. It's only if you stick your head above the ditch that you can start to see issue in context, potentially, and how it links with other issues. So I think initially I'd say be curious about, what is this OD systems thinking type stuff? How can I find out about it? Well, there's tons of YouTube videos, webinars, blogs, you name it. You don't have to do a degree in it to really get a sense of. It's actually quite a broad field. There are lots of different practitioners. In some cases, there are people who purport to be gurus. Steer clear of them. And work out, of the things that you're hearing, what would you most particularly like to develop? Because OD involves, for instance, things like helping top teams come to some very important strategic decisions. So you're interested in that kind of thing. Would you want to facilitate or create a structure to enable, that kind of thing to happen? In which case, what's your starting point? Where would you need to acquire the credibility to work with top teams? And it doesn't mean you have to be the most skilled facilitator, but you do probably need to have some confidence and some competence in how you put yourself over to be given the right to play. Equally, for some people, OD is interesting from the point of view of looking at conflict, how you can get teams working together better, or how you can get more knowledge shared across organizations between departments. How can you try and bring potentially opposing sides together to produce a better outcome? So again, that might take you down a particular route to develop, which could be doing stuff around, there are loads of models around conflict management and conflict resolution at in different ways, depending on what your initial interest is. You can start to play around with some of the issues that you see as problematic. But if you're really ambitious, and you want to do something that's around helping your organization either become more effective as it is, so you're carrying out an organization review to try and identify the blockages, working with people to try and overcome some of those blockages. Or if you're looking ahead, just 2 or 3 years, what's the organization becoming? And doing the same kind of exercise, but involving a lot more strategic scenario planning or whatever you want to do to get people realizing that there are some things coming down the line that we could be acting on now. Then again, you'd be taking a particular route that takes in strategy, leadership, facilitation of some sort. You'd be working, learning how to do scenarios, scenario planning. You'd probably, on the org review thing, if you choose to become, the diagnostic conventional consultant, you'd get a few templates under your belt before you devise your own, to carry out some sort of diagnostic work. But equally, you can work with a team to create a diagnostic which they own and they can monitor their progress through. And if you're not diagnostically inclined, I'm not saying it's either or, but if you prefer to go the dialogic route, then, there's a whole host of interventions, large scale, medium scale, small scale, that you can really go and experience. There are lots of little workshops, learn about how to do a future search or an open space, or do a YouTube or 12 on appreciative inquiry or whatever, but try it out in practice before you then think, oh yes, I think there's maybe something I could learn here before I do any more damage. I'm joking, of course. You don't have to be a professional OD person to do good with these things. But then I think there are programs, if you want to build your confidence, work with a group of people who are also consciously learning, because I think we should all be learning continuously. I certainly aim to do that. But when you're in a group, say doing a diploma course or a master's of some sort, you get the support from your colleagues as well as from tutors. And it can also buy you a gong that can help get you through the door of the CEO, when the moment comes. So, as I said, I think it's primarily observation, working out what you might want to learn next, but having in mind always there's a next. How does this link with something else? How could I use what I've just been doing here to address something over there? Where's my appetite? How big or small do I want my interventions to be? And who else can I work with? Have I got some partners in the business that I can try out some of this stuff with, and grow their skills as well as my own?
Well, Linda, I want to say a huge thank you. We've been absolutely honoured to have you join us today. And you brought two things that we really, really wanted to bring the whole podcast about, which is evidence-based approach with a real rigour to it, but a real practitioner's eye about what it's actually like to be practicing out in the field and the challenges that we have in organisations. And I think in the books that you've written and in the way in which you've spoken today, you've combined them both. And we really encourage people to read your books. And there's so many to explore as well. Danny, what are you taking away from today's conversation?
Yeah, I think people are going to take huge amounts away from this. It's going to be one that they rewatch and rewatch. So I loved what you said about agility not being a template to apply. So the importance of it's not you can't just say this is how we do Agile and do it. So and the importance of co-creating with our people. I liked what you said about top people needing to model that curiosity and how easy it is to drop in kind of questions just to prompt people to start thinking in a different way.
And if people want to follow your work, Linda, what's the best way for people to follow you and the work that you're producing?
Perhaps meet me via LinkedIn. It's the easiest route, as I've always been quite, I've never had a website. That way, hopefully we can share information and ideas. And, as Danny was just saying there, some of the big questions that can actually get top team attention. That's one final thing I'll just say, that whatever you're doing, remember to flush out from what you've learned. What question does that raise that senior management should be thinking about?
Well, can you promise to come back on? Because I think we've only just scratched the surface when your next book comes out, because it gives us a brilliant excuse just to absolutely read your book, every single page of it. And we'd love to have you on. If you are watching this and you think other people that you know would really appreciate it, there's so many people that share each of our interviews each week. And so if they haven't heard about Linda and her work, it's a great way to introduce them to as well. So please feel free to share it. If you enjoyed it, if you'd love it, if you like it, and also subscribe to the channel as well. But most importantly, I want to say a huge thank you, Linda. It's been brilliant. We've really enjoyed this. And it's just been great just to go through the work that you've done with Agile as well. It's been really practical. So thank you.
Well, thanks to you both. Really delighted to have spent time with you. Thank you.